Hi everyone, welcome to the bookshelf or welcome back. I'm Grace and today is one of my favorite videos. I've been waiting to do it for literal weeks. It's been on my filming list for ages and it is books that the one, the only, Jess Mariano would die to read. So this video is going to be split into sections for each book. We're going to talk about my thoughts corresponding with each book and also my thoughts on Jess Mariano as a character and a love interest for Rory, our favorite small town girl. So let's get started. The first book is one that I recently got. You may have seen it in some of my other videos, which I will definitely link below and put in all the tags so you can find them. And it is none other than the 2024, I believe it is the National Book Award winner and also New York Times 10 Best Books of 2024, which is a high esteemed award. There are a lot of great candidates from last year that honestly, I think any of them could have taken it, but the fact that this book did definitely means a lot. And it is James by Percival Everett. It's kind of considered to be like a new classic almost because of the nature that it's related to Huckleberry Finn. And Huckleberry Finn was a classic, as we all know. I think we all grew up reading it as kids, like in school or for fun. And it was definitely one of my favorites, but I didn't love it as much because I was more into Victorian literature. I was the kid with the pigtails and the pinafore. And the fact that I knew what a pinafore was tells you really all you need to know. So James by Percival Everett, I found it at Barnes & Noble a couple weeks ago when I was there with one of my best friends, and I picked it up and I was like, oh, this book is about the Huckleberry Finn, right? The slave from Huckleberry Finn. And I thought that it seemed like such a unique idea, especially from the author Percival Everett. I feel like Percival Everett is one of the writers that I feel like I'm just looking at the poetry right now in the book and already like it's just amazing, especially the poems at the beginning of the book. I feel like that really establishes the idea that the slave from Huckleberry Finn was never really given a chance to be a real, fully fleshed character. And in this book, you see the poetry and you see his inner monologue and his thoughts. And I almost felt like it was a disservice in the earlier book, the Huckleberry Finn classic book, to not develop him as a character because it would have added so much depth to the storyline and it would have added such a three-dimensional element that it had, but not in the same multicultural sense. I feel like that would have been really fantastic to see, but obviously for that time it just wasn't very common, and I feel like now we get that. And that's why this book is so exciting to me. It has to do with classic books, and I mean, Rory and Jess's conversations, most of them are about classic books and their favorite classic books and recommending books to each other. And I already know that if he got his hands on this, he would love it and he would never stop talking about it, and he would probably write a book review about it and probably watch my video about it. Jess Mariano is a character that I think loves classic literature because it reminds him of a timeless period of history, and just never really knew who his dad was. And so he really turned to reading as a form of escape and as a way to, I think, make sense of the world. And when he met Rory, that was all turned upside down because she wasn't really like the other girls that he had traditionally liked. You know, we see him with Shane in the beginning of season 3, and she's the exact opposite of Rory. And although Rory is, frankly, a bit of a pick-me girl about his relationship with Shane, I think that he's doing it as an act of defiance because he almost doesn't want to admit how much of an intellectual art boy he really is. But you know what? Sometimes you have to own up to it. And I feel like this would really make Jess, like if it had come out, you know, when the show was going on, I feel like Jess would have had a conversation or some kind of dialogue bit about how this book is so developed. Ostensibly, it seems like it's just going to be a remake of a classic book. You know, we've all seen those. We've all seen the cringy Pride and Prejudice modern adaptations. But Jess would think that James was a really interesting take, and I think that he would turn it into a lot of maybe sarcastic comments, and he would quote the book, and he would read the poetry, and he would really become even more of an art boy, which we all appreciate, you know. It takes all types to make a literary world, including the art boys. And that is the first book. And the second one is one of my favorites. It's been featured in several YouTube videos of mine, which is Paris, the Memoir by Paris Hilton. And it's one of my favorites. This was actually not the edition that I read. I read the hardcover, which, you know, I feel like we get so attached to the edition that we read books in, even though we're looking at the inside. We spend very little time looking at the cover, but we get so attached to the cover that we read from. But I just couldn't find a hardcover version, so I had to do the paperback. But it still is one of my favorites. I have a list, unfortunately, that's like a couple years going back from like memoirs that came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago that I still haven't gotten to, but I've definitely been meaning to. This book was on one of them, and I read it, and I absolutely loved it. I said a similar vein about James Beaufort in terms of this book specifically, and a deep dive about Maxton Hall is definitely coming in terms of the literary references and allusions and what books the characters are most like, so definitely stay tuned for that. But this book, I feel like Jess has a lot in common with Paris Hilton, because when Jess comes to Stars Hollow, he's immediately a bit of an outcast, and he becomes a bit of a topic in the town where people tend to think of him as the bad boy. He's automatically cast a certain way, basically. And people think of him a certain way, even though they don't really know him necessarily. And even though he had a very difficult childhood and he hasn't really been given a proper chance, people tend to assume things about him, you know, like Taylor and even Luke to a certain degree, maybe, and Lorelai and Miss Patty and Emily and really everyone. And I feel like the same thing happened with Paris Hilton, actually, because she was spoiled and, you know, the dumb blonde archetype. I read the memoir just because I needed something to cross off TBR, and I realized that I've been casting her all wrong, actually, because she really wanted to make a name for herself, and her solo business ventures weren't pushed on her by a faceless management company, but they were her idea to separate herself from her family image and brand. She really wanted to cultivate her own identity in the public, which is so brave for someone who already experienced such intense backlash and scrutiny at such a young age. Like, I feel like people don't always realize how young these women are when they become famous, and they just do whatever they want to sell magazines and get clicks on articles, and they don't always realize that sometimes these women are barely even women. They're girls. They're like 18, 19 years old, and it's crazy to think that, because Paris Hilton was already so much of a public figure when she was so young, and her fashion and her makeup and her outfits and her lifestyle was already so well known before she could even rent a car. And I remember reading this book and thinking, this is so similar to Jess Mariano, because she was also typecast a certain way in the public and then worked very, very hard over a number of years to build a different reality and identity for herself. And she struggled with family issues, and she struggled with being, you know, having PTSD from being in a camp for reforming children, which ended up being extremely abusive. And I won't give too much away in case someone hasn't read this book, in which case I would highly recommend. It's not too long. I think I read it in maybe a day and a half. It's so good, and it has so many allusions to Jess Mariano in terms of character development and growth and trauma and all of those things. And I feel like if he read it, he would really feel seen and heard, and he would get flashbacks of his own memories when he was reading her accounts of things. And I definitely could picture him reading this maybe at the Gilmore house, you know? And I feel like he would really love that book. And the third book, this one is one that I actually haven't read yet. It is Dickens' Fur Coat and Charlotte's Unanswered Letters, the Rose and Romances of England's Great Victorian Novelists. And I found this, actually, I believe, at an antique mall, immediately being enchanted by the idea that it was about English authors, which are some of my favorites, actually. So a quick segue. British literature is one of my favorite subgenres of literature. I grew up reading a lot of British classics, and I grew up also watching Harry Potter a lot, which actually influenced how I tend to talk a little bit. Some of my colloquialisms are a bit British, and my pronunciation of certain things and the way that I write in my books that I write tend to be a bit British sounding. And that's because I read so much British literature growing up, and so finding this book meant that I could know more about my favorite writers and authors from when I was little. And it was sort of like an inner child experience. I really loved finding that in just a random moment at an antique mall of all places, where there was mostly not books like this. And I just randomly found it, and it was great, and it was a great price too. Definitely a big steal. And I feel like Jess would really love this book, because Jess really not only talks about stories, but he talks about authors. Like the conversation in season 2, episode 16, I think it is, where Lorelai goes to the spa with Emily, and then Rory is home alone, and she ends up having like a little dinner party book club situation with Paris and Jess. And they end up talking not about like books specifically, but about authors and archetypes and how those authors would interact with each other. And you get a sense of like what each reader tends to enjoy or how they think based on what writers they love. Like Jess loves Jane Austen, and that really shocks Paris. And this book talks about not necessarily just the famous books that Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte are all known for, but their lives, and you get to know more about them, and I think become more of like a frenzy basis with them, which is one of my favorite things to do whenever I discover a new author. I immediately want to read biographies about them, memoirs, articles, the whole thing. I want to basically become a YouTube level stalker where I just know all the little facts that inspired their writing style and their mindset and their worldview. And I feel like that's why he would really love this book, is because he would get to have so much more knowledge about the authors that he loves, that kept him company during very dark times of his life. Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery. And this is sort of a weird edition of it. It's very like block. It doesn't really look like a classic book necessarily, but it definitely is. And I love it because it's a bit of a quirky edition, and it's a quirky book, so it fits perfectly. But Emily of New Moon, I actually read this just by a weird happenstance, or I read this just by like a weird happen chance, where I read it the same time as I was rewatching some of the seasons of Gilmore Girls that Jess was actually in. And I remember seeing immediately a lot of parallels to Jess, because Emily is an orphan, and she goes to this farm, as a lot of Victorian stories begin. She's an orphan, and there's a tragic plague that takes family members, and then she goes to a farm. And her growing up, what I loved about it so much was that it didn't just talk about like her first year at school or her adjusting to a new life, and it didn't stop when she was 8 or 9. It talks about her life through her teenage years as well, and you get to know about like her little school romances and guys that she meets, and how her trauma influences how she interacts with people, her trauma from passing family members and being neglected or mistreated. And that's one of my favorite things to read about, because it really reminded me of Jess. It reminded me of how Jess comes to Stars Hollow with this baggage from another place that's not Stars Hollow and people that they've never met. And then he meets Rory, and he starts to understand that there are people out there that he has things in common with. And there are people out there who appreciate him for who he is and don't just see him as an archetype. Because yes, he is a moody teenager, and yes, he is emo, and yes, he is broody, but at the end of the day, he really is just a kid. You know? And all of the characters, Rory, when she went through her unlikable phase, and even, Dean, some things that he did, this is a bit controversial, so don't come for me, but they were just kids. They were kids. And this story is about kids behaving in a way that reflects their age and brain development at that time. They're not acting like 35-year-olds making perfect decisions. They're acting like 14-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 8-year-olds. And it works perfectly for this time. And I think that Jess would really love the way that this book articulates that development, and he would really connect with the characters. And those were the 4 books that I think Jess would love. Now, for my thoughts about Jess, I watched Gilmore Girls when I was, I think, 16, and it was one of my favorite shows automatically. And I actually watched it during the fall, just coincidentally, and then I realized that it's like the most popular show to watch during fall and winter for like cozy times. And I got to experience that authentically without knowing that that was the common practice for fans of the show. So that was really special. And I remember season 2 rolled around, and I already watched This Is Us with my mom and dad when I was younger. So I knew who Milo Ventimiglia was, but I didn't know that he was in Gilmore Girls. And so I remember seeing clips online of Jess and Rory before I got to season 2. And I was like, oh, he looks kind of familiar. That Jess kid looks kind of familiar. Who is he? But I didn't realize until I saw like an article where it said Milo Ventimiglia, who plays Jess. And I was like, that's Jess? That's also Jack from This Is Us. And I was like, oh, well, automatically one of my favorite characters, because if you don't love Jack from This Is Us, I mean, you're essentially just a psychopath. But I remember getting to season 2 and meeting Jess, and I say that like, we met up for coffee, but I remember meeting Jess in the show when he first appeared and thinking that he was such an interesting contrast to Dean. And I remember immediately knowing that the 3 main camps were Dean, Jess, and Logan. And over time, the Dean people have just kind of faded into the fog, and that now it's mostly Jess and Logan. Those are where the debates are, is like, is it Jess or Logan? Which one's better for her? And personally, my take is a bit bland. It's a bit like lukewarm coffee here, but I think that they both suited her for different times in her life. And I know that that sounds like a boring answer because I'm not like really angry about it, but obviously I do tend to like Jess more just because Jess aligns more with what I find attractive and what I would enjoy talking to someone about, and what kind of person I would, want to get to know better. But I think that's also just who you pick to root for in any kind of love triangle or multi-love interest show is, whichever character or love interest you yourself would be more likely to want to get to know. I feel like people don't talk about that when they get upset about someone's choice in love triangle. Like, it's just their preference for what they would find interesting and attractive. So it's natural that it would be different. And some people like Logan because he was more upper class and he related to her more on different levels than Jess did. And I liked Jess more than Logan largely for her, late teen years, because he had things in common with her that were intellectual, which she hadn't experienced before with Dean. Not that Dean was stupid, but he didn't read. And he kind of didn't really make an effort to join her in those areas. And Jess already came out of the box like that. And that's why I liked Jess more automatically, because it felt like they had a deep friendship as well as obvious attraction and chemistry. Obviously, as we saw in A Year in the Life, Jess comes back into the picture and Logan is out of the picture. the writers are clearly leaning more towards Jess, which obviously I'm happy about, you know, since I tend to prefer Jess in a lot of situations in the show. And I feel like through my analyzation for what books he would love, I really got to learn more about his character and what he would like, and that's made me really happy doing research for this video. I'm gonna end the video there. That was a really long rant about the show and assorted camps and allegiances, but thank you so much for watching, and thank you for coming back to the bookshelf to chat with me. I am on social media. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and also LinkedIn and Goodreads, so you don't miss any exclusive content. And please like and subscribe to support the video. It really helps push it out to more people so we can all appreciate what books Jess Mariano would love. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!